So good evening. Here we are for our final evening of this series that we're calling Great Figures of History. And this man, Shakespeare, can hold his own with any of them. In a retreat that we had in preparation for our last provincial chapter in May, which was held down in Mount St. Anne's, the facilitator at one stage asked us to jot down the names of significant people in our lives, individuals who had an influence on the quality of our lives and who made a difference to our lives. And it was a private exercise, so after the obvious mention of members of my family and some church people, I found myself writing down the name of Shakespeare, because he has been the companion of a good part of my adult life, and he was there with the appropriate word and insight at different junctures in my life. I remember one of our men, Father Victor Lehan, you would know him, Tom, saying on one occasion that what he liked about Shakespeare was that he said things the way that he'd like to have said them himself. The French have an expression for this, the mot juste, or the right word, or the description of an experience that resonates with a person. Shakespeare is a consummate dramatist, a kind of a universal man, presenting the experiences of life in language of great beauty. Dryden says of him, he was a man who had the largest and most comprehensive soul. When he describes anything, you more than see it, you feel it too. He was naturally learned. He needed not the spectacle of books to read nature. He looked inwards and found her there. He had his begrudgers, of course, who doesn't? A contemporary of his by the name of Robert Greene described him in 1592 as an upstart crow beautified with our feathers, implying that Shakespeare borrowed from other writers at the time. That may be so, but he certainly far outstripped them very soon. The details of his life are remarkably sparse, like when you think of how much we know of somebody like St. Teresa of Avila, also from the 16th century. We know so little about Shakespeare, even though they were contemporaries. He seems to have kept a good bit hidden by design himself, and there's a total absence of information about him from, say, the time that he left Stratford, the age of about 21, until he got to London. At least we have evidence of him being in London 7 years later, which is rather strange. One of his biographers in later centuries, Sidney Lee, sums up pretty much what we know of him, and he does so rather succinctly in these words, that he was a village youth whose parents' material fortunes steadily declined in his early manhood. He injudiciously married as a mere boy, as boys sometimes will, a woman 8 years his senior. Then he left his family in the country to make a career for himself in London. He was stage-struck and longed to act and write plays. In London, after a short interval, his triumphs as a dramatist gained for him an assured position in theatrical circles, never obtained much reputation as an actor. Evidence of his professional progress makes it clear that he was singularly industrious, singularly level-headed, and amply endowed with that practical common sense which enables a man to acquire and retain a moderate competence. His financial rewards were substantial. He husbanded his pecuniary profits. He purchased houses and lands in his native place back in Stratford, where he returned while yet middle-aged to enjoy a placid retirement. As it turned out, he was to die within 3 years of going back to Stratford. Father's name was John Shakespeare, and he was a wealthy man earlier on, held several important municipal offices in Stratford, including mayor of the town or city. Married Mary Arden in 1557, and she was from an ancient and distinguished Catholic family which suffered under the religious persecution of Queen Elizabeth I. Shakespeare's father was probably also a Catholic, and evidence to that effect was found years later in a document hidden away in the rafters of the family home, because to be openly a Catholic in those days was to risk execution. Several instances of martyrs to the faith in that century. So William was probably brought up in the old faith, even though it may have been secretly. He was the third of 8 children and the eldest son, and there's one of the few records left about him is that he was baptized in the Church of the Holy Trinity in Stratford-on-Avon on the 26th of April, 1564. Now, whatever about him being Catholic, he certainly was very Christian. There are many religious references in his plays to that effect. He was very familiar with the Scriptures. He has copious allusions to at least 42 books of the Bible, and he mentions 35 biblical characters. People have often speculated on how much of himself is in his plays, and that's the perennial question that's asked about all artists, I suppose. Suffice it to say that it's impossible to hide your personality completely in your creations, and there's no doubt that it's personal experience that gives authenticity to all art. Our own Patrick Kavanagh was asked on one occasion how long it took him to write a particular poem, and his answer was 20 minutes and a whole lifetime. Shakespeare had, certainly by our standards today, a vast output of writing, 38 full-length plays, 154 sonnets, and a few longer poems, and most of his plays are still performed worldwide. He's the most quoted author in the English language, and he coined about 2,000 new words for the language. Stratford-on-Avon is one of the most visited sites in England. His plays are still performed there on a regular basis in wonderfully imaginative ways. Came across something on the internet the other day. A young English girl, only 13 years of age, her name is Becky, but she's trending on the internet at the moment, all because she posted a scribbled list of what she called, and I have a slide of it here, things we say which we owe to Shakespeare. A whole list of them there that she came across or maybe thought up, but they're all genuine expressions that we use today, like send him packing, make your hair stand on end, to lie low, love is blind, the green-eyed monster with bated breath. Even the top one there, knock knock, who's there? Comes into Macbeth, set your teeth on edge. Anyway, that's only a sample, but we're constantly using expressions that Shakespeare was the first to use. During a recent 6-year sojourn myself in Oxford, I must have been present for about 10 different plays in Stratford-on-Avon. I could be sitting down to a play in Stratford at 7:15 and be snug in my bed back in Oxford by midnight. 3 major places to visit in Stratford, many of you will have been there, I'm sure, are Shakespeare's birthplace in the town, Anne Hathaway's cottage, Anne was his wife, and Mary Arden's house, Mary Arden was his mother, where there's a garden with 52 kinds of plants and flowers. That's how many he mentions in his plays, testimony to his astounding powers of observation. His plays and poetry are of a consistently high quality. Seldom does he relapse into the banal or the ordinary. Having said that, I remember one of our priests who taught us in our junior seminary down in County Cork, regaling us one day with an episode about one of the other students in a class below us. Joe from Shannon was his name. Joe's best talents were on the football field rather than in the classroom. But anyway, one day they were doing some of the lighter verses that come into Shakespeare's plays, and the particular one in question was, I'm not sure whether this is as you like it, anyway, where the bee sucks, there suck I, in a cowslip's bell I lie. So he asked Joe, what do you think of that? Well, to be quite honest with you, Joe said, you'd expect better from Shakespeare. So our man said anyway, it was worth waiting all his teaching life to get a comment like that. So honest, and indeed in pure Shakespeare had the odd off day too, you'd expect. Now what I want to do most of all this evening is simply to luxuriate in the beauty of the language that Shakespeare uses to articulate the experiences that we all have in life. One thing that astounds us about Shakespeare is the vast range of his life experience and his ability seemingly to learn from even a single experience. One is reminded of St. Therese of Lisieux, the little flower, how In her case too, one experience was enough for her to learn a lesson for the whole of her life, whereas with most of us we need a repetition of experiences before the message hits home. So Shakespeare was a man who seems to have experienced the whole gamut of human emotions and experiences, and had that unique ability then to articulate these in memorable language that still holds readers and audiences in thrall all over the world. And he crowded so much into his brief 52 years of life. He treats captivatingly of the great themes of human existence, life and death, good and evil, love and hatred, joy and sorrow, greatness and weakness. And he waxes eloquent on the trials and tribulations of humankind, from the possibilities of greatness to the reality of abject failure. The greatness is lauded, with Hamlet, for example, declaring, "What a piece of work is a man! How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals." In The Tempest, Miranda, who's cooped up in an uninhabited island since childhood, with only her father, Prospero, and the subhuman Caliban for company, is struck with wonder when she beholds a few survivors of a shipwreck. "Oh wonder," she says, "oh wonder, how many goodly creatures are there here! How beauteous mankind is! Oh brave new world that has such people in it." And her father Prospero's rejoinder, "'Tis new to thee," hints at the frailty that those with experience of human beings see all too clearly. And this frailty and weakness is further indicated in a memorable passage from Measure for Measure. "Man, proud man, dressed in a little brief authority, most ignorant of what is most assured, his glassy essence, like an angry ape, plays such fantastic tricks before high heaven as make the angels weep." The carry-on in North Korea and the tweets coming out of Washington point to the perennial relevance of these words. The myriad experiences of life, from what Shakespeare calls our exits and our entrances, from the cradle to the grave before this brief candle is extinguished, these are portrayed by Shakespeare in matchless drama, in a mesmeric cascade of images and unforgettable language. In charting the 7 ages of man, he gives unparalleled insight into the great and the good and the not so good, and he reserves his most mordant comments for the power greedy. The abuse of greatness is when it disjoins remorse from power. Mention of the 7 ages of man, of course, reminds us of that memorable speech of Jacques in As You Like It. So we'll look at a video of that now. Now, those of you attending this talk live will see video clips of some pieces in the course of the evening with professionals reading. Those of you catching up with it on YouTube will have to be content with my own reading of these passages, because we don't want to infringe possible copyright. Mention of the 7 ages of man reminds us of that memorable speech of Jacques in As You Like It. "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. At first the infant, mewling and puking in the nurse's arms, and then the whining schoolboy with his satchel and shining morning face, creeping like snail unwillingly to school. And then the lover, sighing like furnace with a woeful ballad made to his mistress's eyebrow. Then a soldier, full of strange odes and bearded like the pard, jealous in honour, sudden and quick in quarrel, seeking the bubble reputation even in the cannon's mouth. And then the justice, in fair round belly, with good capon lined,
with eyes severe and beard of formal cut, full of wise saws and modern instances, and so he plays his part. The sixth age shifts into the lean and slippered pantaloon, with spectacles on nose and pouch on side, his youthful hose, well saved, a world too wide for his shrunk shank, and his big manly voice turning again toward childish treble, pipes and whistles in his sound. Last scene of all that ends this strange, eventful history is second childishness and mere oblivion. Sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything.
Various attempts have been made, as you know, especially in recent times, to make Shakespeare maybe more relevant to the contemporary world, some more successful than others. The last performance that I saw in Stratford was The Merchant of Venice, and Graziano was dressed as Elvis, performing in Las Vegas, if you don't mind. But the performance of Patrick Stewart, well-known Patrick Stewart, as Shylock was so wonderful that the modern bits did not take from the overall performance. Having said that, I wasn't overly taken by the conclusion of the play, where the director went beyond the script, and we had the humiliating scene of Shylock being forcibly baptized a Christian. It is implied, of course, in the play. Shakespeare touches on the heavy slog of life, the unrelenting boredom that often assails humankind. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. His characters ripple with vitality, mirroring the virtues and the vices of humankind and manifesting the wisdom and foolishness too of human behaviour. In Hamlet, isn't it, Polonius is a bit of a waffler, but wouldn't we all be wiser if we took his advice to give every man thy ear but few thy voice? Or to heed him when he says, this above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. And how many of us in the major decisions we've faced in life haven't pondered within ourselves to be or not to be. And in our dithering we may have discovered that the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, though sometimes we may find that conscience doth make cowards of us all. All these expressions occurring in perhaps the best known of all Shakespeare's soliloquies, to be or not to be. And we'll have a clip of that now. This particular one is recited here by Kenneth Branagh in the film that he directed himself. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. To die, to sleep, no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep, perhaps to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin?
Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, makes him pause, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pitch and moment, with disregard their currents turn awry and lose the name of action.
The joy and pain of love is a constant theme in Shakespeare. He readily admits that the course of true love never did run smooth, and his plays have many examples of this, this love that looks not with the eyes but with the soul. And while he often describes a love as fickle, has anybody spoken more beautifully of love's fidelity? I often quote this at weddings. Love is not love that alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. It is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempest and is never shaken. And a memorable passage in The Merchant of Venice would grace any marriage ceremony, civil or religious. I think this is Portia speaking to Bassanio. One half of me is yours, the other half yours. Mine own, I would say, but if mine, then yours, and so all yours. Equally memorable is Shakespeare's description of the things that choke love. Oh, beware, my lord, of jealousy. It is the green-eyed monster which doth mock the meat it feeds on. The present Pope Francis speaks much of the destructive power of gossip and its capacity to damage, destroy reputation, to which we all have a right. And the scheming and hypocritical Iago in Othello sums it up well. Good name in man and woman, dear my lord, is the immediate jewel of their souls. Who steals my purse steals trash. 'Tis something, nothing. 'Twas mine, 'tis his, and has been slave to thousands. But he that filches from me my good name robs me of that which not enriches him, and makes me poor indeed. It's really in addressing the pain of life and the human condition that Shakespeare is at his most telling, as he reflects on, as we saw there, the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to, as people suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And yet his tragedies have an uncanny capacity to uplift, as their powerful cathartic effect. That's Greek, of course. The Greek tragedy is the same. This cleansing effect that it has deep in the soul. Sometimes when Shakespeare speaks of the pain of life also, there's a strong undercurrent of the Christian vision of the potential refinement that suffering brings when born in the right spirit. For example, sweet are the uses of adversity, which like the toad, ugly and venomous, wears yet a precious jewel in his head. And this our life, exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything. Shakespeare knew tragedy in his own life. His son, Hamnet, who was a twin, died at the age of 11. And significantly, most of his tragedies were written after this. He wrote Hamlet a year after, which was a case of a son trying to come to terms with the death of his father, when he, Shakespeare, was trying to come to terms with the death of his son. As a rule, he doesn't let us in on his personal life in his plays, at least not explicitly. But it's impossible not to sense a certain autobiographical note in the deeply emotional response of Macduff in the play Macbeth to the brutal murder of his 2 young children. Pressed by Malcolm to fight it like a man, He responds, I shall do so, but I must also feel it as a man. I cannot but remember such things were that were most precious to me, all my pretty little chicks. And he poses the distraught question, did heaven look on and would not take their part? Shakespeare also had an extraordinary ability to blend pathos into his comedies, just as he blended comedy into his tragedies. And blending pathos into his comedies, an example was the public humiliation of Malvolio in Twelfth Night. I saw a version of this directly from Stratford recently, came through in the cinemas. And they had cast Malvolio as a woman. She was called Malvolia. Don't think it came off myself, but anyway, it's beside the point. It was still very well done. But anyway, this is the humiliation of Malvolio, that amid all the hilarity of the denouement of the play, the audience's sympathies are aroused for the hapless Malvolio as he's psychologically damaged by the practical joke gone wrong. And we're left with a disturbed feeling, really, instead of the undiluted fulfillment that comes from a happy ending. And that's a common enough strategy of Shakespeare. His endings often leave us with ambiguous feelings. Doesn't always resolve the enigma in his tragedies. He leaves us with the mystery and draws us into it indeed. Shakespeare's plays, in covering the whole spectrum of human experience, show a lovely empathy and compassion for the human condition. The pathetic sight of the old and dying King Lear leads to one of the bystanders saying towards the end of the play, the oldest have borne most, we that are young shall never see so much nor live so long. The theme of Measure for Measure is very much that of making allowances for human frailty, though the play runs into the difficulty of discerning how divine mercy and human justice can be implied in an imperfect world. Isabella touchingly formulates the wide sweep of God's mercy. Alas, alas, why all the souls that were forfeit once, and he, capital H, and he that might the vantage best have took, found out the remedy. How would you be if he, who is the top of judgment, should but judge you as you are? Oh, think on that, and mercy then will breathe within your lips like man new made. During the recent year of mercy, as I said, many people recall the tender words of Portia, spoken as she tried to melt the hard heart of Shylock, who's intent on his unbending form of justice. I'll show you a clip now. This particular one, among many that you could call up, is taken from a recent film of The Merchant of Venice, featuring Al Pacino as a wonderful Shylock, Jeremy Irons as Antonio, and the piece you'll see then is Lynn Collins as Portia, described as a young lawyer. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His sceptre shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this sceptred sway. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute to God himself. And earthly power doth then show like as God's, when mercy seasons justice. Therefore, Jew, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. Time is a preoccupation with Shakespeare. He's almost obsessed, fascinated with it. He's acutely conscious of the preciousness of time and the transitoriness of life. Maybe he had a sense of his own life being destined to be brief enough, just 52 years. He made his will only a month before he died, while apparently in good health. It's a long, long will. That was kind of the custom at the time. Begins off, "In the name of God, Amen. I, William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, in the county of Warwickshire, gentleman, in perfect health and memory, God be praised, do make and ordain this my last will and testament in manner and form following. That is to say, first, I commend my soul into the hands of God my Creator, hoping and assuredly believing through the only merits of Jesus Christ my Saviour to be made partaker of life everlasting, and my body to the earth whereof it is made." Seems to have given most of his money and possessions to his two surviving daughters, Susanna and Judith. Susanna already married to John Hall, Judith to marry shortly after Shakespeare's death. Most of the attention in the will publicly seems to focus subsequently on the bit towards the end. "I give my wife my second best bed with the furniture." But we shouldn't read too much into that. The will is dated the 25th of March, 1616, and the date of his burial in Stratford Holy Trinity Church was 25th of April, 1616, exactly a month later. Given Shakespeare's heightened consciousness of the brevity of life, several of his characters speak of the importance of seizing the day, seizing the opportunity of the present moment, carpe diem. In Julius Caesar, well-known words, "There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. Omit it, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat, we must take the current when it serves, or lose our ventures." Time is on the mind of the hapless Richard II, too, in the loneliness of his prison cell, as he laments, "I wasted time, and now doth time waste me. I wasted time, and now doth time waste me." The ravages of time and the unnerving prospect of declining years is a recurring subject with Shakespeare, especially in the sonnets, of which there are 154. Now, much speculation has taken place in the last 400 years or so about the context of Shakespeare's sonnets, when exactly they were written, whether Shakespeare himself intended them to be published, the identity of those to whom the sonnets were addressed, the young man, the dark lady, the rival poet. Auden even went so far as to say, "Probably more nonsense has been talked and written, more intellectual and emotional energy expended in vain on the sonnets of Shakespeare than on any other literary work in the world." So rather than waste energy on these kinds of questions, it's better to simply savour the beauty of the language and allow each sonnet to speak for itself without the contortions of trying to figure out the context. According to Helen Wendler, a great commentator on literature of all kinds, she says, "No poet has found more linguistic forms by which to replicate human responses than Shakespeare in the sonnets. The greater sonnets achieve an effortless combination of imaginative reach with high technical invention, a quintessence of grace." Many of the sonnets, as I say, are preoccupied with time and the ravages of time in eroding beauty. Sonnet 60, for example, you may have learned this at school. "Like as the waves make towards the pebble shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end. Time doth transfix the flourish set on youth, and delves the parallels in beauty's brow." Another name for wrinkles. Delves the parallels in beauty's brow. And as the poem progresses, then time is seen as the agent of destruction, defacing the beauty of youth, eating away at the bloom of health, and eventually making way for the grim reaper, death. And towards the end of the 14 lines, then, after such growing devastation, it's refreshing, maybe surprising, to come to the hope expressed in the couplet at the end of the sonnet, where the cruel hand of time gives way to the hoped-for immortality of verse, whereby the worth of the beloved may be perpetuated. The last 2 lines, and yet to times in hope my verse shall stand, praising thy worth despite his cruel hand. Common aspiration of Shakespeare, especially in the sonnets, that even though every life ends and we're all mortal, bound for the grave, there's something immortal in verse that can transcend the centuries. One of his most glorious sonnets is the oft-quoted sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? I assisted at a sad funeral a few years ago. A mother whose little son, born with a hole in his heart, didn't get surgery in time, lived for 6 months, but died, and she had the courage to stand up on the day of his funeral and recite this poem. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe, or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Beauty, another recurring theme throughout Shakespeare, and this topic, of course, is enhanced then by the sheer lyrical beauty of the language that he uses at times, maybe most of the time. Lovely expressions like daffodils that come before the swallow dares and take the winds of March with beauty. If music be the food of love, play on. One of you mentioned Sister Bridge, Lorenzo, to Jessica, begins off, how sweet the moonlight sleeps upon this bank. Nuala quoted about music, the man that hath no music in himself, nor is not moved with concord of sweet sounds, is fit for treasons, stratagems, and spoils. And then many of the plays are about the beauty of soul, nobility of soul, well expressed by the grudging observation of the malevolent Iago in Othello, speaking of his rival Cassio. He hath a daily beauty in his life that makes me ugly. In reflecting on beauty, Shakespeare articulates too the deep human desire for immortality, the immortal longings of Cleopatra, unsatisfied longings and unrealized dreams prompt him to intimate the oft-quoted lines of St. Augustine, Lord, thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. Mortality, immortality, these are there's a constant interplay between these two, and death crops up in a lot of his writings, not just his tragedies. He looked on sleep as a kind of a preview of death, a sleep that knits up the ravelled sleeve of care. At times Shakespeare is stoical enough about death, as in Julius Caesar, where he has Caesar himself speak these memorable lines, Cowards die many times before their death. The valiant never taste of death but once. Of all the wonders that I yet have heard, it seems to me most strange that men should fear, seeing that death, a necessary end, will come when it will come. Death is no respecter of age or rank. Golden lads and girls all must, as chimney sweepers, come to dust. Even kings are not immortal. In Richard II, within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king, keeps death his court, and there the antic sits, scoffing his state and grinning at his pomp. There was a series on BBC a few years ago called The Hollow Crown, dealt with the historical plays, Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, and Henry V and Richard II, I think. Last scene of all, death is the transition to another place, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns. Mystery of death, poignantly expressed by King Lear as he holds the lifeless body of Cordelia in his arms. Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life, and thou no breath at all? Oh, thou'lt come no more. Never, 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 never. Who but Shakespeare could coherently use the same word 5 times, one after another, with increasing degrees of pathos and bewilderment? The final words of The Tempest, spoken by Prospero, have often been considered to be Shakespeare's own farewell to the stage and indeed to life. A few pieces here, recited by the great Shakespearean actor John Gielgud, 3 short speeches from the end of The Tempest.
Our revels now are ended. These our actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit, shall dissolve, and, like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as our dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. That's from The Tempest, Act 4, Scene 1. And then Act 5, the last scene and the very last words. Now my charms are all o'erthrown, and what strength I have's mine own, which is most faint. But release me from my bands with the help of your good hands. Gentle breath of yours my sails must fill, or else my project fails, which was to please. And my ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. As you from crimes would pardoned be, let your indulgence set me free. And the stage direction says, he awaits applause, then exits.
The rest is silence. When Shakespeare's own voice was silenced just over 400 years ago, the man who declared that there was a special providence in the fall of a sparrow entered the new world that often figures in his plays, actually. He seemed to envisage a thin veil between this world and the next, and he has people visit this world constantly from the other side. For us, we're immensely indebted to this man who used his God-given genius to so enrich the human spirit. And all in all, we can apply to him the words that he himself put on the lips of Mark Antony, pronounced over the dead Brutus. His life was gentle, and the elements so mixed in him that nature might stand up and say to all the world, this was a man. We shall not look upon his like again. I've really only scraped the surface because we're dealing with genius here. Shakespeare is an endless subject of study, debate and controversy. I read the other day that there are over 1,000 new publications about Shakespeare every year. And still they gazed, and still the wonder grew that one small head should carry all he knew. What a man.